The topic of this session is driving productivity in a time of change, technology, people, and digital divide. As you all know, we are in the midst of a tectonic change. We are still trying to grasp the significance of this change since it has far reaching effects in all walks of our lives. As we come out of this, and I'm pretty sure that we will come out of this, the one overarching question which is on the minds of everyone, a lot of policymakers all over the world, is how do you increase the productivity of a nation in time of such a huge change? To talk about this big question for this session, we have brought together big thinkers, thought leaders, and visionaries in their own domain. We couldn't have expected a better group to talk about this extremely important topic of current times. So now let me introduce you to Dr. Sivaram, who will lead this session for us. Dr. Sivaram serves as the president of Western Digital Corporation and is also an esteemed member of the USIBC Global Board. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Sivaram. And I know it's very early in Los Gatos in California, so thank you very much for waking up early for us. Dr. Sivaram was formerly the founder and CEO of Twin Creek Technologies, solar panel and equipment manufacturing company. His prior experiences include being the Chief Operating Officer of Matrix Semiconductor, Executive Vice President at SanDisk, and General Manager Intel Corporation. Dr. Sivaram is the Chairman of the Board of Akshay Patra USA, the world's largest NGO focused on feeding school children. He is a trustee of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, RPI, his alma mater, where he received his PhD in material science in 1986. Dr. Sivaram is distinguished alumnus of the National Institute of Technology, Trichy. He is also on the board of Global Semiconductor Alliance. With that, and without further ado, Dr. Sivaram, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Abhishek. I have with me two extremely esteemed guests with me this morning. Let me introduce them to you first. Professor K. VijayRaghavan is the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India. He has been in this role since 2018, and prior to that, he was the Secretary of the Department of Biotechnology in the Government of India. He is a distinguished professor of the National Center for Biological Sciences, where he was the director before this. Professor VijayRaghavan got his chemical engineering degree from IIT Kanpur, then his PhD in molecular biology from TIFR, and has been a postdoctoral fellow, research fellow at Caltech. And we also have Sridhar Vembu. Sridhar is the founder CEO of Zoho. Zoho is a maker of cloud-based business software with over 35 million users worldwide. And Dr. Vembu has a PhD in electrical engineering from Princeton and started his career at Qualcomm. And Zoho has been blazing the trail with their move into India and growing rapidly. So with that, let me begin the conversation. The conversation will have some time where each of our esteemed guests will have the chance to present their views, and then we'll have an informal conversation that goes between us, among us. And we'll open it up for questions from the audience, time permitting, towards the end. Let me start this with Professor Vijay. You have an extremely important job in the middle of very difficult times. And as Abhishek talked about it, productivity is in the minds of everybody. Productivity for such a large country with diverse population is a very complicated problem, and I want to see how you define productivity. We have seen, for example, at the end of crises, after World War II, the Japanese worked extremely personally hard to bring the country back up. So Mr. Narayan Murthy, for instance, has been talking about Indians who can afford to may have to work 16 hours a day to bring the country back. So personal productivity is one. We know, for example, technological revolution in the late 80s and 90s, when the personal computer came into being, overall industrial productivity grew up. In India, we have had massive technological growth over the last 2 decades. How does your view shape the views of the government in thinking about and defining productivity for the whole country?
Thank you very much, Shiva, and really good to be here with you and Sridhar, and also to be here with this distinguished audience. It's always a pleasure to interact with you all. You asked about productivity and what has happened and was happening even before the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's been highlighted by the pandemic, is a dramatic change in the way productivity can happen in the world. Over the last decade or so, it has moved from being substantially anchored in industrial revolution kinds of ideas about materials to a combination of ideas and materials, and how ideas and materials work together defines productivity. Now, this poses enormous opportunities and challenges for a country such as India. We have a demographic dividend because we have a large number of young people, but in practice, that dividend is accessible to a relatively small elite in today's rather demanding world of productivity, right? So the first challenge about productivity for the government is to expand the access of the tools of productivity into a large population. Fortunately, it is not only one of machines which and skilling those areas which needs to go, it's skilling in ideas and how to implement them. Now that needs to be accessible in your native language, and that needs to be accessible independent of whether you go to elite institutions or ordinary institutions. And therefore, rapid training in clear thinking and execution is the major powerful force to transform productivity on scale. So that is a critical aspect. The second aspect of productivity for us as a country is how does one compete in a situation where manufacturing is moving back to sites close to where it is needed rather than by labor arbitrage and shipping over long distances. Now, that is something again where India can be very competitive and is becoming competitive because of supremacy of design. With quality design, from everything from shoelaces to supercomputers, right? If design is the focus and that access is there to everyone, exporting quality design on to cables, as it were, can increase productivity and income enormously. There will be manufacturing locally, but this export of design allows quality manufacturing to take place on site everywhere. Whether you're making a jet engine blade or whether you're making a semiconductor chip, design is going to be critical. And that's something which I think, again, these are areas where India has the opportunity now to exponentially go up, where it linearly increases manufacturing capabilities.
Let me turn it over to you, Dr. Vembu. You have made some very interesting personal choices. You have personally relocated back to India. You're running a truly large-scale software company that is multinational out of your headquarters in, and I'll let you describe it yourself. Describe your personal journey. What has been very successful? What are challenges that you think we still need to overcome? And how does this fit in this concept of productivity?
So first of all, thank you for having me in this conversation about productivity. And I actually agree with Professor Vijay about the ideas and materials combining in the new age of productivity. It is not just material widget productivity. And you started off with how hard we have to work in order to achieve this productivity. But when you combine ideas and the material, maybe you don't have to work so hard that 16 hours a day, all of that. That is, I think, and clearly, and I am a person who seeks balance in all of these. That I don't see the point of, we don't live to serve the economy. The economy lives to serve us. I mean, I like to think that way, right? So in that sense, I think we have to have a balance. And stepping back to our what our own journey, what we have learned. First, when we got started in '96, our per capita GDP in India was what, $350, $400. Now it's about $2,000. And even then I recall thinking the gap of what, $300, $350 to what was an advanced country then would be $30,000. You are talking about a factor of 100. And it's very clearly this is not justifiable by the human resource capability. I mean, we are exporting people to Silicon Valley after all, right? And so we are better than 1%. We are better than 1% GDP, right? In terms of GDP per capita. So it was obvious to me then that we could drastically raise the productivity in India if we could tap our own hidden talent pool. And today we are maybe a factor of 20 or 30. The factor of 100 has shrunk to factor of 30, but still it's a factor of 30. It's not a factor of 4 or 5 still. So there's still a lot of potential to be tapped. And how do we tap it, right? And that is, to me, the essential thing from the beginning was how do we train your own workforce to compete on a global scale. And I actually, in the beginning, I decided if we compete in the highest margin businesses, then we have as Warren Buffett would call it, a moat. I mean, even if we don't do as well in the beginning, there ought to be some margin there. In fact, rather than, that's why we just decided, well, I decided in '96, then we must compete with Microsoft because they were the highest margin business in the world at that time. I said, then we must go after them. Because, I mean, Jeff Bezos caught it very well, and once he said, your margin is my opportunity. Well, Microsoft is a sitting duck. And they are largely doing it with Indian talent. So there ought to be talent here to compete with them, right? It's obvious when you think about it. So then that was the basis on which, in fact, even in '96, '97, I would tell our people, someday we are going to be in a head-to-head war with Microsoft. Prepare for it right now. We might as well prepare for it now because we are going to war with Microsoft eventually, right? So that is what I always thought about this, how I thought about this problem. But I also knew that you have to do this step by step. So I think that way about Microsoft, but I also thought that we have to follow the Japanese, how they did it. Japanese didn't set out to compete with the GM and Ford day one. Honda motor was actually not a Honda motor, it was a Honda motorcycle. And it was a bicycle attached with a small, it's a 50cc moped. That was their first motorcycle, really, right? And today, of course, they are a leading car maker in the world. So you have to climb step by step in the ladder, and Honda acquired the skills along the way of doing it. This is where I believe that we really didn't, get this idea well in India, that there is a step by step in the ladder of productivity that you can climb. And a lot of these later steps only come to you when you are doing the earlier steps. So you ought to first be on the first step, second step, only go to the next one. So that was the lesson that we learned, and it's gratifying. 25 years later, we actually have some really good products, and now we are scaling up faster now.
So as we look at it from a truly large multinationals perspective, I'm with you on this idea of Professor VijayRaghavan on moving materials and ideas. Whereas we are from the prior economy focused on building the materials infrastructure, building roads, airports, railways, goods, transportation, the focus now shifts tremendously in moving data. Generating data locally, processing data locally, transporting and giving accessibility to that data securely in every part of the country, whether it be video, whether it be raw data, that ability, that infrastructure, we think is one of the biggest drivers of productivity from a technological perspective that we can give. Now, as you develop the people, as Sridhar was talking about the education and where they come in, this infrastructure, if it was present, now that we are watching this to happen, we truly believe that the data infrastructure in all its aspects, whether it is storage, whether it is networking, whether it is processing, whether it is transportation, whether it is IoT, whether it is endpoints, that infrastructure and its ability is going to play a huge role in improving productivity for the country. And we, in India, I mean, much of our development happens in India for that reason, that it is a very high potential area for us to proceed. So with that thought process in mind, let me come back to you, Professor. With COVID and with the migration of people back from the urban areas going towards their villages, the problem got a little bit more complicated. There was now a set of people who have experiences in the cities now going back to their villages. Do you see this as a temporary phenomena, longer lasting phenomenon, or how do you think in terms of the change that this is going to cause in the rural areas, and now relate this back to our overall concept of productivity?
You know, one thing which it's still early days, but I think what is dawning on us is the dramatic changes which have taken place post-COVID are not likely, as I said, it's still early days, but I suspect they are not likely to easily be flippable back to the previous situation. We are going to see a much more complex, different kind of emerging economic situation. Now, let us take the issue of workers. Workers who come from villages, different states, and come to work at centers, they typically come, they are typically male, they come leaving their families behind and go back periodically each year to the farm or for visits. Now, this is not a sustainable or should not be a sustainable mechanism for scaling the economic growth of a country from the perspective of their family and their environment and so on. This is something which, as Sridhar says, it focuses on the economic engine at the cost of other requirements, and that's not valid. So in some ways, the COVID crisis allows us to rethink this in a substantial manner. What is work? What is the workplace? What is the nature of interactions between that? And I think we're going to see a significant revisiting of that in multiple ways. Now, keep in mind that, again, this physical and internet lives, as it were, digital lives, are becoming more and more prevalent in India. Because of a consequence of the COVID crisis, the digital reach has been enormous in a very short time. Telemedicines and e-pharmacies are now going to become normal. They have already scaled up enormously. Agriculture will also have a huge impact of the digital in it. In other words, the prime focus of the digital economy are going to be on the social sectors, agriculture, education, and health. These, if you raise people above a certain threshold so that their families reach out and do other things and not fall back. Right now, the situation is a small trip, an illness in the family, a crisis, a cyclone can bring back a significant number of people back into poverty. That should not happen, and the buffering should increase. And I think the digital material connect is allowing that to happen on scale. Medicine, agriculture, and education will become accessible to a lot more. It is not, people, the classicists will argue that this is not the right way. Everyone should have a teacher right there in their school who nurtures them and allows them to grow. Absolutely true. But, you know, we're not comparing that with a digital approach. We're comparing a combination approach to what we have now, and that has the potential for raising people out of poverty.
So that leads directly into some of your thoughts, Sridhar. I know you have mentioned in the past about classical institutions, engineering schools, and centralized universities where we take people out of villages and then move them back into the cities. You have argued against it, and you have thought about how education and employment need to be related. So I want you to describe to us both your thoughts and what you're directly doing about it personally yourself. You're muted.
So, yeah, I was muted. Yeah, so that's why So if you look at, first let me describe the state of a village where I'm in, the region, this Tenkasi region, this district is fairly largely rural. The largest city here is about 75,000 people. So in this district, so that gives you an idea. It's a very rural district. Pretty much other than agriculture, there is some tourism because it's a scenic spot, waterfall, all that is here. Other than that, most of the industry would be labor export. That means you have skilled people who leave. There are plenty of colleges around, but people leave. So there is a lot of topsoil erosion. And I mean the human topsoil. So the universities become vacuum cleaners of talent. That's what I call it. Very efficient vacuum cleaner. You suck the talent out of a village or a small town and you render it into Chennai or San Jose or Seattle somewhere, but they don't stay here, right? And this is not, and yet the district itself is left behind with 1.5 million people. It's a relatively small, it's a new district and there are 1.5 million people. So it's not like we are going to export all of them, right? And majority of them will never leave. So there has to be a balance. And I actually did this with our, there is in the village where I am, I assembled people and asked, look at what comes into this village. Motorcycles, smartphones, gas stoves. Look at what goes out. Rice paddy. Rice bags go out pretty much, and maybe some coconut. And I asked them, how many rice bags do we have to sell in order to buy one smartphone? That is our problem. Right here is our problem. How many rice bags do we have to sell to buy a smartphone? And unless we achieve some balance, either we have to sell our lands, all the people lose their lands progressively, or sell ourselves, meaning move ourselves elsewhere and get out and go into debt. So this is the rural district crisis in India. All over India, this is true. Okay, you have to leave in order to prosper, and if you stay here, you are in debt. And any consumption you do of any higher value good, your smartphone puts you into debt, pretty much. And there has to be, and today, in fact, I don't believe even the US has solved this problem. And you see for example, I always contrast the San Francisco Bay Area with Stockton, which is very close by. Stockton is practically at the edge of the Bay Area, but nobody would confuse Stockton as the Bay Area. The economic situation is substantially different. I mean, you have almost first world and third world levels difference, right? Within a 1 hour, 2 hour driving radius, an hour and a half. So that, if that kind of asymmetry or unbalance persists within a country, then within a region, then you can see that between villages here and big cities. So that's one of my big problems. Okay, and then what do we do about it? That is what the primary question. And I've thought about this for over 20 years on this problem. About 12 years ago, we started our office here. This very office where I am right now. We have about a 500% development center here. Just smack in the middle of, like opposite to us is a rice paddy, and there is a pond, and there is a coconut grove, typical rural scene, and we are in the middle of it. Our nearest town would be about 10-kilometer drive, nearest town, and everything is a small dot villages. And in fact, sometimes it's even hard to say which particular village we are on, because we are kind of in between villages. That's where our office is. It was an abandoned fruit pulp factory, and we bought that facility and we converted it into a software development center. And we actually, of course, where do we find the talent, right? About 5 or 6 of our Chennai engineers moved here originally. After that, we recruited locally and trained. Of the 500, maybe about 400, 450 would have been trained locally. They would have been recruited within a 1 hour, 2 hour passenger train radius, I'm going to call it. I won't say driving radius. Driving radius doesn't apply here. Passenger train radius is a better term here, right? So you can reach, for example, Tirunelveli by about 1.5 hours by passenger train. That's the radius from which we draw a lot of our workforce here. And we have done quite well. Actually, we ship products that are selling in Germany, selling in San Francisco very well. So Zoho Desk is the software that we build here. And other products now have joined the fray here. And then I myself moved here about 8 months ago before COVID in order to expand these and also start other similar efforts. That was the goal even about 8 months ago. I called it a sort of rural, cloud-based rural revolution. That's what I called it, because the cloud enables us to work from anywhere. Then I thought, why don't we just take advantage of it and do this, expand on this idea. And then, of course, the pandemic struck. Now it's accelerating. And as of last month, we took a survey of our own employees in Chennai. We have about 8,000. 3,000 have expressed interest in moving back to their hometowns, smaller towns. They don't want to stay in Chennai anymore. So that's where, which means we are now actually beginning about 6 or 7 small centers where with 20, 30 people each. We are starting it out in proper villages. And that's where we are right now. And we are, of course, waiting for the lockdowns to end because right now we cannot do too much. Everybody is at home. So.
It's a fascinating story, Sridhar. I mean, I'm just inspired by what you have accomplished so quickly from having 3,000 people wanting to leave Chennai and going back to their villages to do it. Now, we almost sound old-fashioned compared to what you do. So we end up hiring about 3,000 people in Bangalore from, I'm telling you, the finest of the institutions in India. And as Professor VijayRaghavan was talking about, we focus on the high value activities, design and development and marketing. So the one thing that we have learned over time is that the labor arbitrage idea of just moving for lower cost labor does not pay in the long term for the bigger companies. For us, the creativity of the people in India is what we are looking for. So we end up having these large design development, market development, marketing organizations for worldwide in urban centers such as Bangalore. And as I said, we hire young graduates from all of the prestigious institutions of India. So the question, however, is that we tend not to do manufacturing in India, but actually we think the higher value added activities are even more useful, both to us and to the country. The secondary networks that form outside of this, the catering company that works is the building maintenance company that works with it. These are all developing secondary employment. We spend close to about $200 million into India every year. So the question back to you, Professor VijayRaghavan, is this. You talked about these new areas like telemedicine or telehealth or e-pharmacies and agriculture, etc. The higher value activities have to transform the social activities today. How do you envision that transformation? I mean, what happens between here and then as we take in, instead of all the focus going in transportation, but into these, either be agriculture or health or banking? What do you see as the transformational activities between now and where we want to get to?
You know, thank you very much, Siva. I'll take off from what Sridhar pointed out, that you need to generate high value products in rural areas. And I remember many years ago, probably about 20 or 25 years ago, I was on a walk in some Swiss village and was shown into a big barn. And that barn had the most exquisite lathe and milling machines anywhere at that time and was manufacturing components to be exported anywhere in the world. This was a small out of the way village. Now that metaphor needs to move into India now, and what Sridhar is doing is exactly that. Today's tools allow you, both in terms of software, and I'll come to hardware also, to actually manufacture for export quality components and systems across scale. You know, if you grew up in India in the 60s or 70s, you would be familiar with everyone carrying a transistor radio and listening to cricket commentaries. Those transistor radios were made by village groups, women typically, from village to village on a printed circuit board, soldering resistors or capacitors or transistors, someone assembling it and going on. That was really high tech at that time, and that was done locally. Today, two revolutions allow that to come back, and even 100-fold high tech products to be manufactured, to be exported. And those two revolutions are, first of all, the availability of energy. Energy can reach every nook and cranny much better now than ever before. The second revolution is the revolution in power transistors. This means that for small amount of energy, you can drive motors of various kinds, whether it's your farm equipment or your cutting machine or your two-wheeler and so on and so forth. So this is actually transforming the material components of those societies rather substantially. When you combine those material changes with what Sridhar and others are doing, that links marketing to the entire world, breaking through the middle person. And therefore, whether it's farm products or high-tech products, villages can become the center of productivity, upending this view that migration to cities is inevitable. So this should be something transforming multiple economic sectors. Agriculture poses a particular challenge because Indian agriculture is typically the farm holdings are small. Now, coupled with a variety of other burdens which we don't have time to talk about, which are hopefully being lifted. But fundamentally, global agriculture was hinged on this point that I will give you water in abundance, I'll give you pesticides in abundance, I'll give you fertilizers in abundance. Scientists go ahead and increase yield. And given those boundary conditions, scientists delivered on increasing yield without consideration of how much of these other three one used. Today, if you impose new boundary conditions of being environmentally friendly and ask for yield as well as quality, that conditions can be met. It requires, it's a certain cost. That cost is a cost to save our future. So a combination of these kinds of boundary conditions which look at our environment, both in terms of productivity as well as waste management, and in look at manufacturing, and link that to the digital world, allows the smaller units, villages and small towns, to be both culturally and emotionally revived, which is very, very important.
So coming back to the question of productivity, my former boss at Intel, Andy Grove, used to say, anything that is measured improves. So I want to come back and ask you, Sridhar, I know you have very uniquely developed views on non-Wall Street imposed set of metrics. You think of productivity and all of these in your own way of measuring productivity. It's not just return on invested capital or in terms of stock price or what I return back to shareholders that you focus on.
I mean, Becky did a very good job of making sure that,
Can you, so would you, Sridhar, please give us your perspective of how do you measure productivity? What do you, in your company's sense and in otherwise, what are things that you should look up to? Okay, in the future, here's a number we should be looking at. How do you visualize this?
No, there's you started with productivity in the economic sense, what matters to GDP, income, all of that, and that matters to a company as well. That is the revenue per person, or really gross value added per person. Value added per person, more than revenue per person, but revenue per person is often a proxy used. So in that sense, if you look at the Indian economy as a whole, of course, the revenue per person is a lot lower, reflecting our own lot lower GDP. So that's the first thing I would look at in any area I go into is what is the revenue per person possible in this, which also then kind of sets what can we afford to pay. And we want to lift incomes. That means we have to go into higher productivity possible areas. So that's the only way to pay better. And so that is the first thing I look at. The second, you mentioned what is different about Wall Street versus this. I'm a capitalist, but I don't want to be answerable to Wall Street because I want to allocate capital. I don't want a Wall Street fund manager allocating my capital. Basically, that's it. Whereas I'm a better capital allocator than some hedge fund manager sitting in New York. So I don't need to report him. So that's why I don't take it public. That was the simple reason. And I actually don't trust those guys also. I don't trust their motivations too often. So that's, then I keep it private because I don't trust them. I don't respect them. I don't want to report to them. It's simple, right? And then I get to allocate our capital and in fact, Warren Buffett has operated on the same exact principle. He allocated capital. He didn't let Wall Street allocate capital. He allocated capital. So even in the US, people understand Steve Jobs always wanted to allocate his capital. He didn't let Wall Street allocate his capital. It's just that once you're a public company, it's not that easy. All this stuff happens. But that's why we decided not to actually go public at all and stay private. That initially imposed a slower growth rate on us, but actually now we are not capital constrained in our growth. We are more constrained by the same things everybody will face us. How fast we can recruit, train, all of those kind of issues. So that is one level. And so it's the motivation is fundamentally different. And why do I want to allocate capital? Because these are the kinds of things, rural, how do we create employment? Those are the areas that I care about. In other words, I'm not interested if my hedge fund manager bought a $100 million apartment in London. That's not my personal concern. So I'm not working for him. That is why I don't actually, I want to allocate capital. I don't want him to allocate capital. That's simple.
So, Professor VijayRaghavan, you have an interesting answer to follow up on. He is thinking in terms of a private corporation and his ability to allocate capital. You, on the other hand, has to allocate capital for a country where you have very conflicting set of priorities, all that have to go simultaneously. So I have a two-part question for you. First is, in the return back to normalcy, whatever the new normal is post-COVID, where should we be focusing on allocating the country's precious capital? That's one. The second question that follows is, you also mentioned earlier about the migration being male-dominated coming back. 51% of the country is female, and we need to have them fully participating in this economy if we are going to improve productivity. How do we address that part of the question? So those are two questions for you, and it's expansive, so take your time to answer these.
Well, it is a question which covers a big expanse, and it certainly expands from multiple points of view. But it certainly also is a different kind of answer from what Sridhar would give. And it's important, I'm not in the finance ministry or a finance person, but I think what we can do is, no matter what the country's priorities are, and they of course has a mixed portfolio of priorities, two aspects will be very, very important. And they have their, subtext also there. And those two are people and the environment. Both are going to be really, really critical. India's large number of young people hold the future to both India and the world. And they are getting prepared at multiple levels. The crisis actually shows that in many ways, we were much better prepared than we thought in terms of our response mechanisms and so on. And in many ways, the challenge still remains in terms of our size. So people are going to be critically important. And that's not just training. It's training linked to jobs. So it's a push and a pull. Both have to be together on scale. That's one. Secondly, the world in general has become addicted to products of high quality and low costs. And part of those low costs, or a substantial part of the low costs, come because we are not paying for future environmental costs. In other words, we are asking future generations to subsidize our low-cost products today. And therefore, whether it is food or devices or technologies or travel, we get things cheap because the next generation has to pay. And this kind of a hedging and passing on the buck to future generations will result in an accumulation of problems. At some point, there'll be a breakdown. And part of the spillover which we see in pandemics is because of the close juxtaposition of environmental issues and human issues in a manner which increases those probabilities. So no matter what the investment is, and the government is investing hugely in water, a water mission, in nutrition missions, in electrification, those will generate jobs and solve those kinds of problems. But all those problems need to be linked to people and the environment also.
We have a few minutes left, Sridhar. I would love to hear your final thoughts on this conversation. What are your admonishment for the audience? What would you like for us to focus on? Give us your parting thoughts on this. You are muted, Sridhar.
My really favorite topic right now, the topic that consumes most of my time, is how do we raise the productivity of the rural workforce to a world-class level, to be able to compete in the global economy without leaving their homes. Without leaving their homes is important for several reasons, because both from not overcrowding our own cities, we don't want even more crowds in Mumbai and Delhi and in Bangalore and Chennai, all of these places, and two, even to preserve the rootedness of our culture. Most people don't want to leave their home, and we are uprooting them today. So all these mean that we have to figure out this whole puzzle of how do we raise the productivity so that a rural citizen, a rural resident, can take part in a high productivity global economy without leaving their homes. And that the crucial part, like Professor said actually about Switzerland, that is exactly a role model for me. Some countries that have actually studied, Germany, Switzerland, and Japan. For example, the world's largest robotics company, Industrial Robots, Fanuc, is based in rural Japan. And there is a lot of such companies in Japan that are in deep rural areas, and they're able to compete with the best in the world. So it is possible. And how do we make it possible? And clearly we have to start from the beginning to train. And so the way I say it is, we actually combine an engineering education along with employment. And lots of this education, as you know, you have worked in the high-tech sector. What Intel does cannot be taught in a school, really. You have some basic material science or whatever training, and then you learn the rest of your semiconductor technology in an Intel or in a Western Digital, in your disk drive or the storage context. So most of this knowledge is very contextual. If I'm building compilers, if I'm building semiconductors, I know that field very well. If I'm not, I'm studying about it, I only know so much, and the rest of it I really don't have access to. So only in the context of a job can we really provide the training. So, and that is our traditional mistake in India, if I may, is that we have set up all these rural engineering colleges, but devoid of that context. Often we are then complain that the graduates are subpar. The graduates are subpar because there's no context for them to learn. There's no real industrial activity in their local area. So it's kind of a bookish learning, and then exams that test something that's not even relevant. So that is why I don't actually believe in that model. And we really have to have industry and education go together. In fact, education driving industry driving education together in a holistic pattern. That's what really I want to, if there's one thought that I want to leave with this, that is, it's really that. So thank you.
Thank you, both of you. I mean, this has been a fascinating conversation. The idea of moving ideas and materials and the way we have to rethink how we employ in rural areas. How do we make sure we train locally? How do we maintain sustainability? How do we make sure people, environment are both improved along with the material improvement? How the economy works for us and not the other way. Fascinating topics for us to pursue. Thank you for an illuminating conversation. Thanks for allowing me to participate in this with you. And I will turn it back to Abhishek Kishore.
Thank you very much, Siva. That was a very well moderated session. And thank you very much, Professor Raghavan. Thank you very much, Dr. Sridhar. It's just a fascinating conversation from the digital divide. I mean, the last 45 minutes have been the most insightful. I mean, the comment from Sridhar about competing with Microsoft to cloud-based rural recovery to higher value R&D in India, and then looking through the middle person, the blurring of physical and digital. It's just fascinating. So thank you very much. Let me extend my heartfelt thanks to our distinguished guests, Professor VijayRaghavan, Siva, and Sridhar. Thank you to all the attendees, and hope you enjoyed the session. We have an exciting lineup of sessions coming up today and tomorrow. Just now, we'll be starting with a keynote with Minister Gadkari. So you must have already received a link for that. So